Hey everyone, my name is Michael Scott. I'm an alcoholic. Grateful to be here tonight. Steve mentioned that this group really likes long speakers. Probably give you at least an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes if that's what you're used to. Teasing. I'm grateful to be here. My sobriety date is February 2nd, 2012. I'm a member in good standing of the Change Agents group of Alcoholics Anonymous. We meet in Raleigh by the fairgrounds every Thursday and Sunday night at 7:30. Our format is a book study on Sundays, and on Thursdays it's a newcomers meeting. So if you're ever up in the area, we would love to have you. I don't get the opportunity to speak very often, so if I appear nervous, it's because I am. Pretty sure God will step in and take care of that pretty quickly. But the last time I was at the podium was about a month ago, and toward the end, I realized that I really should kind of preface things on my experience. It's been a journey with step 2. And what I mean by that is it's just a journey in coming to believe in a power that's, greater than me, obviously, and a power that can restore me. And I wish I could say that I came in here and I got a sponsor and, worked a few steps and everything was just fine. And I guess that is really my experience, but the finding God part, truly in my heart, took a little bit. And it took a little bit of experience, and it took some work too. Anyway, I'll give you a little bit about my background, and I think maybe it's important to say that I'm a man that has found peace and contentment and happiness through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's pretty amazing, because I don't think that I knew what the word peace or serenity meant before I got here. I was just the kind of guy that would just try to wrestle control of everything. And honestly, I thought it was pretty successful up to a point where I got to, I wanted to stop drinking and I could not. It just was not possible with my own human power. I had a very good, solid family, solid upbringing, only child, upper middle class up in the Northeast. I was a reasonably gifted student and a reasonably gifted athlete. I did not want for anything. My parents are still married. They are about to celebrate both of their 80th birthdays. And I'm happy to say that they live nearby. So I've been able to have a relationship with my mom and my dad that I didn't know that I wanted, honestly, until I got sober. But when I started drinking at I don't know, probably 16, in what I would just describe as kind of a normal way. Like, my buddy stole a 6-pack of beer out of his dad's fridge, and we drank it in the school parking lot. And I remember having a lot of fun. I was with some friends trying something new, and tasted terrible, but it got a little buzz. And I don't remember the sky opening up and me thinking, like, I really need to do this, like, every day, every hour for the rest of my life. But I had enough fun that I drank as often as I could moving forward until I didn't want to do that anymore. I didn't have very much character as a young man. I was not afraid to lie to you. I was not afraid to manipulate you. And I also felt just a little bit different, and I don't know if that contributes to my desire to drink or not, but there's no reason looking back why I would think any of that stuff is true. I continued drinking. Really the only thing that changed over the years was the amount that I drank and the consequences that it brought. I managed to finish up college, drinking more than my friends. I got a good job, moved out to the West Coast, lived at the beach, met a woman, married her. Well, she married me, amazingly enough. And, I was drinking through that whole thing, but not like to incredible excess. There are things that are clear along the way. I started having a cocktail at night when I was probably in my mid-20s to just kind of get to bed. When I was dating my wife, I kept a bottle of rum under the sink at her apartment. I don't think she had any idea that was there. But it wasn't ever a problem. It was kind of a pain reliever. And looking back, I understand now that what I was trying to do is just escape me. I was just trying to escape any feelings that I would have, whether they were good or bad or, just on a normal day. I guess I just really didn't like the person that I was. And there was some deep-seated fear there that I didn't know was there. So I can see that stuff looking back, but in the middle of it, I just thought I was a regular, average social drinker. And, if you would have pointed the finger at me and said that I'm different than anyone else, I would have completely disagreed with you. Over the years, I started drinking more and more. I got to the point where I was drinking probably about 1 liter every night. My wife started thinking that I wasn't the most supportive husband. I realized that my son was kind of getting in the way a little bit of me and my drinking and the stuff that I wanted to do. But I still would have told you that I was a good dad and a good husband. I started having consequences maybe around, 35, somewhere around there. So I'll just tell you a little bit about a few of the consequences and then some of my character in that time. I guess I'll start with the character. I said I wasn't afraid to lie to anybody. My drinking became a problem to my wife to the sense that I would drink until I passed out at night, and sometimes I would wake up kind of falling toward the bed, trying to get to the bathroom, to the point where she trying to be kind to me, put a bell on my bedroom door because she didn't want me sneaking downstairs and coming back with a cocktail. And I told her, I must be sleepwalking or something. It was not entirely true. I keep that bell in the house today just to remind me of how things were. I don't know if she really understands the significance of it to me, but it just goes to the character for me. I was lying. I needed to drink. I needed to bury my feelings. And I would tell you that I just needed to sleep, right? We all know that's not sleep. At some point, I decided that it was probably a good thing to contact some old girlfriends that I was dating back in the day and, just check on them and make sure that they were all right. I told my wife a little bit about that, and she didn't freak out, so I figured it was probably some kind of tacit approval. But looking back on that, my first sponsor was about 20 years old, and he looked at me when I was telling him that, and he was just kind of shook his head, and he's like, you continue on with this dishonest behavior, I can't sponsor you. I was like, dude, you're like 12. What are you talking about? I just didn't understand that honesty and kindness and love were even necessary in life. AA and sponsorship taught me that. And it's deeply embarrassing to talk about. But the consequences started coming on my 10th wedding anniversary. We went to Hilton Head, and I woke up one morning and my wife was disgusted, and apparently I had gotten drunk and passed out, and she had to kind of hold me up going to the bathroom, and she was disgusted enough that she was like, look, this has to stop. It's either going to be this drinking or me. And I was like, well, okay, that's an easy decision. The consequences are coming. Obviously, I'll stop drinking. Why would anybody let consequences get in the way of life? It's not that important to me. So, truthfully, I did manage to stop for a little bit of time. It was probably 3, 4, 5 months. And the next piece of this is really kind of illustrated in a lot of the book and other people's experience, I stopped for that time. It didn't have that much difficulty, but I went on vacation again. And I remember we were at a condo in Florida, and we had visited my parents, and there was beer in the fridge. And I just remember being in the kitchen one night, and I decided, you know how this goes, like, hey, that salad and pizza, beer would probably go pretty well with that. My wife wasn't so angry anymore. She saw me crack the beer. She didn't say like, hey, whoa, that's a problem. But the realization is this. Later on that night, I kind of looked up. I was standing in the kitchen. Everybody else was in bed. And there were 6 beer cans on the kitchen counter. And I was just standing there reading a magazine. And I kind of looked at them like, how did those get there? That was not my intention to drink 6 beers. But I absolutely did. And I remember being kind of confused by that. As sometimes we do, that just kind of led me to believe that I could probably drink responsibly. And so I was right back in it. I don't want to stay drunk for very long. We all have pretty similar stories. But if I can relay anything, it's that I'm the type of person that would tell you, like I just did, that of course consequences will stop me from drinking. Right? I wouldn't let anything get in the way of a good, happy life, especially the one that I was trying to build with my wife and my son. But I can give you a couple of examples of consequences that did not stop me. At 40 years old, I had a heart attack that was purely due to my drinking. My blood pressure was out of control. When I got to the ED, it was something like 300 over 280. If you've ever seen one of those meters that kind of tops out at 300, people were just kind of shaking their heads at me like, how are you even like alive here? So they admitted me in the hospital. I remember the ED doctor looking at me. She's like, just one question. She's like, you don't really fit the weight profile, but do you do copious amounts of cocaine? She's like, this is kind of odd that you're here and you're so young. She's like, but you got a little bit of meat on your bones, so I just want to check. I said, no, that's really not it. And she said, okay, well, this is confusing. We're going to send you upstairs. So they kept me in that hospital for about 10 days. They did, every test under the sun. I think the bill was $120,000. You would think that at some point during this whole journey, I would be like, hey, if you guys are confused, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but I drink like this liter and a half of liquor every night. I didn't say a word. I did not say a word. So the powerful and sad part of that story is I got released, and they sent me home, and they kind of patted me on the back. They said, sir, like we don't understand really what happened. You seem to be medically stable, so we're going to send you home. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my wife, and the sun started going down, and she was like, well, gosh, that was a really rough time. She was by my side the whole time. She was, basically living in a hospital. She said, why don't you go up to bed? And I did. And then I started staring at the clock. And I don't know what time that clock said, but I know that I was really uncomfortable watching that clock. And she came up to bed and fell asleep. And I remember just sneaking right back down the stairs. Literally nearly died from this alcohol stuff. And I physically remember reaching down under the sink to grab the bottle. I couldn't stop. Needed to pass out. Didn't know how to be okay with myself. I wish I could tell you, that was the end of it, but it just wasn't. I'll tell you one last story about being Father of the Year. At this point, my son was probably 8. My wife was working a lot. I was, I guess, employed, but I'm certain I was not a fantastic employee. So my son was sick, and I told my wife, I said, how about I go sleep on the floor in his room, and you get a good night's sleep since you got to go to work in the morning. So what I remember is the next morning, my son, remember, he's about this big. I'm back in my own bed, and he's poking me. He's like, Daddy, are you okay? So Father of the Year here apparently had got drunk, passed out in his room. And I really vaguely remember this, but I had gone into his bathroom, and I had fallen. And I had hit the corner of the sink right here in between my eyes, and I had bled all over the place. I mean, like there was a pool of blood on the floor, and you could see handprints, which I vaguely remember, of me trying to get up and get back to wherever I was going, which was probably to get another drink. I think consequences will stop me. I think consequences will stop me. So I had enough honesty at that point. I went to I called my doctor and I said, hey, I've been lying to you guys. I said, is there any way that you'd be willing to help at this point? She said, sure. She said, you can go back to the hospital and you can tell them that I said that from what you're describing, you are most likely an alcoholic. You most likely will go through withdrawals, and you just pray that they admit you. I had enough desperation at that point that I did that. And they did admit me. And that was a beautiful thing. And again, I wish I could tell you, like, hey, that's all it took. I'm good. But I remember laying in that bed. It was probably day 2 or day 3 in the morning. You know, the sun starts streaming through the windows of the room. And I've got this blanket on me. And I'm feeling good. I'm like, maybe I made a little mistake here. Do I really need to be in a hospital? Maybe, I don't know what's wrong with me. How did I get here? And so my next recollection is I look over this way and the door opens and my wife is coming in and my small son is behind her and things get real hazy. I'm told that I called her by an old girlfriend's name and then had a massive withdrawal-induced seizure. The next thing that I know, I was waking up. It was the next morning. I'm told that I had broken through a couple of sets of hospital restraints. You know, not like the leather ones, but, you know, the stuff that they tie you down with when you're freaking out. And they told me that they gave me enough Ativan to stop a rhinoceros. And I was bewildered. But to me, that's my ego, right? Like, all I'm thinking about is myself. I'm not thinking about anybody else. I'm not thinking about any recovery. I'm not thinking about stopping. I just want to drown out the feelings. And I don't even know that that's what I want. It's just what my actions indicate. At that point, I was willing to be honest. And they treated me for those seizures, and they treated me for all the other stuff that goes along with drinking a whole lot of liquor for a whole lot of time. And they finally came to me and they said, look, you're medically stable. Like, we're ready to release you. Do you want to go home? I don't know why, man. I was just, all I could say and all I could feel was no. I had no idea where they were going to send me or what they were going to do. I just had enough. And I was afraid that going back home would, put me right back in that cycle. So there's a detox that's in Raleigh. It's called Wakebrook. They sent me over there. Spent about 9 days there. They had classes and people coming in, even talking about, like, here's some. If you want to sponsor, here's some line items that you might want to look for in the sponsor. I'll tell you, if I'd have tried to go through half of those, I never would have found anybody that's qualified. And I love people in the recovery community because they want to help. But sometimes just, a book education doesn't get you to the point where you can relate to anybody. So thank God I was there, and thank God that place allowed 12-step recovery to come in. Because the most amazing thing for me is when groups of Alcoholics Anonymous came in and, they started sharing their stories. And they were young and old, and they were, man and woman. Just as much of a spectrum as the population as you can imagine. And I don't know why I thought I was so alone, but they were all telling my story. And they all walked in and they were laughing and they were joking. And they were talking about those things while I was angry and terrified and sitting in the corner like, how have I gotten here? And the one thing that I remember a lot of people saying is, if you don't ever want to drink or drug again, you don't have to. All you got to do is do what we've done. So I talked about this journey with step 2. When I was in treatment, there was a young man that came back the next night and kind of tapped me on the shoulder. Said, "Hey man, if you need a sponsor, you look like you might need a little help. If you need a sponsor, I'd be happy to help you." And I looked at this kid, and he was kind of red in the face and shaking a little bit and obviously nervous. And I was just thinking, like, seriously, what I said before, like, you're 20. Like, what are you gonna teach me? I'm a 40-year-old man. I had just enough wherewithal to say, like, yes. Kind of like, do you want to go home? I didn't know what was going to happen. I just knew that I needed help. And I did realize that he was the one that was standing there sober, right? I'm the one in the treatment center crying. But I talk about things that God did for me that I don't believe that I would be willing to do based on my own ego and pride. And I could tell you, once I was out of there, I would go ask somebody for help and to sponsor me, but I really don't think that I had it in me. But before I left that treatment center, I had a sponsor. They were allowed to pick us up and take us to meetings. So I had a sponsor and a home group before I left there. Don't really think I had much gratitude for that, but looking back, it was amazing. Because my problem is me, right? And this was the biggest stunner for me in this whole process, is that I thought that alcohol was the problem. Hey, I just stopped drinking, everything will be fine. And that young man, he said, like, look, here's what we do. We're going to get together. We're going to read this book together. I didn't know the steps were in there, but apparently we got to read something. He said, I want you to call like 5 guys every day, and I want you to talk to them about what's really going on. I didn't do that. I think I told him at some point, like, yeah, I'll call them when I need them. I'll call them, thank you, I'll call them when I need them. We were going to meetings and all that, and I was just, kind of along for the ride. I wasn't doing anything. But I had this example of these men and women in front of me that all I really had to do was follow. I talk about my ego a lot. I'm not sure if you'd have told me that I needed to do something, that I would have done it. But I didn't have to be told. I just watched what these other men were doing and figured if it was working for them, it might be okay for me. I switched sponsors because that young man got tired of me, and I was still like, oh, he doesn't want me anymore. Hand me off to somebody else. But that guy had been chased out of his house at knife point, and I got to go back to his house, and his wife greeted me, and they were back together, and they had kids, and he just basically repeated the same thing, like, this is what we do. Get in the car. This is what's going to happen. At this point, I didn't have any interest in finding God. I had no interest in a spiritual solution. I saw that it said that in the traditions and the steps. I was still willing to do stuff. But I think I was hoping at that point that you would just tell me how to do this thing. Could I maybe do the drinking a little bit more successfully, or at least with fewer consequences? So when I told that young man that I would call the guys when I needed them, he kind of laughed at me. I learned a lesson. The alcohol wasn't the problem. I'm the problem. And when I don't have the alcohol, all I'm left with is me. And that was a really painful place for me to be. All those feelings that I had stuffed down deep inside of me throughout the years started bubbling back up. And I had no idea how to deal with them. My wife was yelling at me, deservedly. There was a lot of anger from her. She told me that she did not want to be married to an alcoholic. That was curious because I figured, again, I stopped drinking. Everything's fine, right? But what happened, I got so miserable and terrified. I don't know, she probably screamed at me. I left the house, I started driving, and I started picking up the phone, making phone calls. And I probably made 8 phone calls, and not a single man picked up the phone. I had the wherewithal to understand that that was my fault. I didn't develop the relationship with these guys. You know, I basically gave them that spiritual Heisman, like, thanks, I'll talk to you later when I need you. But I was so desperate, I started talking to their voicemail. I had been encouraged to do that. If you don't get me, and I tell people that too. There's a nice lady at the end that'll tell you, all right, that's enough. It's about 3 minutes long. So by like that 8th phone call, in 3 minutes of message leaving for each one, I started to feel a little bit better. Didn't understand why. And then I guess somebody along the way had some willingness to listen to the message from me because they started calling back. But I found that the honesty and the willingness to talk about what's really going on with me is indispensable. I didn't want it. I didn't want the spiritual thing. I didn't want the step 2 journey. But I was willing to do it. I started working the steps, reading with my sponsor. We ended up doing a 3rd step prayer on our knees in front of a bunch of people at a church. And I was kind of looking around like, you want me to get on my knees now? Like we're going to hold hands? And that's something that I look at today as a blessing. Like I can read, talk about anything, pray on my knees or not in front of anybody. It's an amazing freedom to be able to do that and not think about me and what other people might think about who I am. Man, that 4th step and the 5th step, those were probably the first time that I really needed to have any sort of honesty and to dig and to talk about stuff that I guess I just described for me as just gross stuff that lived down in the pit of me that I thought that I would just take to my grave. I didn't want to reveal it to anybody. There was one thing that was particularly difficult for me to talk about, and we got to the end of that 5th step, and my sponsor had said, like, if there's something that's really troubling, just write kind of an asterisk on there, and then we could talk about it one-on-one. You don't have to put it on paper. But I was kind of convinced that I wasn't going to talk about that thing. And we got to the end, he's like, is there anything that you're not telling me? And I realized I had been honest about everything else. Like, why am I holding back at this point? And so I told him what was on my mind, what was so shameful, and he just kind of looked at me and said, okay. Anything else? And I may have even clarified, like, hang on, I just told you this thing that's like the most shameful to me that I have done. And your reaction is like, what's next? That was amazing to me. And then he told me, we've all done things that we're ashamed of, and he's heard worse, and I've ended up hearing worse too. And I have the same reaction. It's like, okay, the things that we've done are not important. It's what we do with that becomes important. And I remember talking to him the next day, and he asked me, he says, do you feel any lighter after you've done this 5th step? I said, I don't know, maybe. I said, I certainly feel like I can talk to you about things. I can talk to another man about things that I didn't think that I could. I wanted to keep to myself. And he said, well, that's good and that's okay. Because the real power starts in this 6 and 7 thing. Oh, you mean the God part. But I was willing to pray. I was willing to read those paragraphs. I was willing to, ask God to release me from these defects of character. I was willing to try. I came away with a list of character defects and a list of actions to take to make amends. And I was in agreement with all of them. except for one. Had to do with my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law, who I love dearly, is not always the most pleasant person. And I was terrified of having to make amends with her. And so what I did, I called all these guys that I knew. I called one guy, I had he's 35 years sober. I'm like, Tom, what do you think? Everybody else was like, probably what your sponsor says is what I think. Tom was like, yeah, I think your amends is with your wife. I don't think it's with your mother-in-law. I was like, cool, good. Don't have to do that one. And then I found myself in a room with my mother-in-law who lived 1,000 miles away. And I was looking at her and I was thinking, and I just realized, I'm willing to come this far. And I still want to hold on to this ego. I can navigate myself through this thing. I just remember looking up. I was like, Mom, I was wrong. I don't know the rest that I said. And I think her reaction was probably a little bit even more dismissive than I expected. It was probably a little too emotional for her. My point is, I was willing to do that thing that I thought, again, I'd probably just skip that part, right? I'll still be okay. I'll do most of this stuff. Some stuff I'll just keep to me. It'll be all right. At this point, my sponsor's still picking me up. We're going to meetings. We're going to pick up guys from this detox and take them to our home group. And my sponsor starts asking the guys in the car. He's like, "Hey, you guys got sponsors?" They're grumbling. One guy's like, "Yeah." Two others like, "No." And then there's another guy. It's like, "What's a sponsor?" I'm in the front seat, and Gary's like, "Hey, well, that's great because this guy needs to start sponsoring people." I didn't think I was qualified. I was terrified of it. And I was thrust into it. And one thing that really resonated with me, my grand sponsor pulled me aside. I should probably talk about him. He's a fabulous dude. And how much of an ass I was to him. But anyway, he pulled me aside. He said, "Look, man, this is important. And if you're fearful, it's not just you sponsoring this guy or these guys. It's you and it's your sponsor and it's me and it's his sponsor and all these men and all these women that have this experience. And you're perfectly qualified to do this because you're sober today and you've worked a few of these steps. All you got to do is be honest. I know you got a problem with that, but be honest." And so, I found that was an incredibly life-changing event for me because, this is not unique. If I'm making a suggestion, I'm pointing the finger at somebody else, I got 3 of them pointing right back at me. It forces me to examine my life, and I am not comfortable anymore suggesting that somebody do something in their life that I am not doing or willing to be doing in my own life. So it gave me a new perspective. I think that one of the most profound sections of the big book is where it says, we were prepared to look at this thing from an entirely different angle. What's my part? All of it. All of it is my part. More things that I didn't like. I talked a little bit about my lovely wife, who some of you have met. She really is a lovely person. She's put up with a lot of selfishness from me. But she really did. She said, "I do not want to be married to an alcoholic." And I had no idea what that meant. I had gone to see a counselor, a therapist, and I was making some progress, I thought. He decided, "Hey, why don't the two of you come in together and we'll have a session and we'll try to work this thing out." And she came and she sat and she listened, and I remember, the guy said, "Ma'am, I think there might be some things that you could use some help with, and my practice would love to help. I'm going to leave it in your lap, in your hands. If you want to make an appointment, please do, but I think it'll help you guys grow together." I left there with some hope, man. We got a doctor involved again. It's all going to be good. That dude's going to fix us. Fix my sponsor and his wife, so I got nothing to worry about, right? She had a knife. My wife just said she didn't want to be married to an alcoholic. So I waited about a week and I asked her, I said, you going to make that appointment? Have you made one? A lot of anger at that point. She said, no. This is your problem. You are the one that's messed up. I have nothing to do with this. So you figure it out. I started making friends with all the guys in the room that had gotten divorced. I figured that's probably what I needed to learn next, is how to have a successful divorce. My sponsor said, kind of flippantly, said, well, looks like there's nothing left for you to do but pray. Back to step 2, right? Probably told him, like, what's that going to do, buddy? You know, he told me, he said, at some point, if you keep doing this thing, a light will start shining in you, and your family will want to pray with you. And my God, the snort that came out of my mouth at that point, it's kind of like, you don't know my family. You don't know what I'm dealing with. But the truth of the matter is, all I had left was some prayer. And I don't know if I did it successfully or not. But I'm about to celebrate my, if I'm sober and kind, celebrate my 24th wedding anniversary. I don't know what happened. I was told to leave the girl alone and pray. And that still doesn't make any sense to me. But it seems to work. Somewhere along the lines, that grand sponsor that I loved, that I didn't like then, suggested that, you know, we were meeting as a group of guys in the back of a restaurant, going through the steps, you know, little tradition study, stuff like that. And my grand sponsor told my sponsors, like, I think it's time for you to grow. Why are you guys meeting in the back of a restaurant? You should probably start a meeting. My sponsor was an idea guy, still is. There's somebody that's got to execute it, right? So I helped execute this meeting. Started out, a bunch of guys, you know, did all the things we needed to do with GSO, put it in the intergroup thing and published it. And there were like 10 guys that were meeting, and did that for a few weeks. And my sponsor looks at me, he's like, we're going to need some more chairs. I said, Gary, it's like 10, like 12 of us at some point. So we ain't going to need any more chairs for a long time. Gary moved to Florida a couple years ago, and I started working with another woman as a sponsor. And she, at that point, had stepped in and said, hey, you know, I understand you guys are trying to put together this group. You know, if it's a bunch of guys, this really violates a lot of the things that we try to promote here. Try to be inclusive to everybody. Maybe you might want to think about having women there. And I remember thinking, like, yeah, but then I can't, like, talk all kinds of stuff that I want to talk about because there's going to be these girls here. Just stupid, right? Because if nothing else, we talk about a solution and a common solution. It doesn't have anything to do with whether you're a man or a woman or anything in between. We share a common solution, and I am so grateful that Susie, my sponsor today, suggested that. Because at some point, we needed to bring in more chairs. We switched rooms. We got, you know, on occasion, 150 people in that room. And more than half of them, or at least half of them, are women. And strong women, and women that teach me things. And women that I can go to and say, hey, I don't understand what's going on in my life. Can you give me a perspective that maybe could help me? And then they laugh at me. But then they tell me the truth. And that's so, I mean, it's so indispensable. I feel like I could talk for a lot longer. I'm happy, I'm content, and I'm peaceful But everything wasn't always, roses and butterflies throughout this process. In 2017, so my son is a pretty talented soccer player. Played a lot. We had a great relationship because I spent 4 hours a day driving him around. After I was able to make he was the first amends that I made. He was, I think, 9 years old. 2017, he was 16 years old. He had a sudden cardiac arrest on the soccer field. I remember meeting the ambulance at the hospital and seeing his feet and his boots coming out of the back of the ambulance. Didn't really have any idea what was going on. My wife got there, and they're working on him. And man, that pesky pastor from the hospital kept coming around asking us if we wanted to pray. Didn't dawn on us till like 6 hours later that nobody in that room thought he was going to live. Love that kid. Turns out that through all the medical intervention and everything that happened along the way, he's still alive. And I still fought with how that happened, meaning I'm still on this second step journey, right? And I really tried to explain this stuff away. When he died on this field, the fact that our friend and cardiologist was walking up the sidewalk, the fact that I'm at my home group a couple of days later and the EMT that was on the ground with him was talking about, I didn't know that was your son. He was in the pediatric ICU as a 200-pound, 6'2" kid. A friend of ours was the doctor that founded that unit. School nurse pulled my wife and I aside a couple months afterward when he was healthy enough to go back to school, and she said, "Do you know why I was wearing scrubs that day?" We're like, "No, what's this got to do with anything?" She said, I had a premonition. She said it was the first day of school and I was supposed to be wearing a dress. There's some ceremony that they do. She said, I felt like I needed to wear scrubs. She said, all day I was walking around wondering why I'm wearing these scrubs, looking for whatever I'm supposed to be looking for. Said, school ended, and she's like, I don't know, what? Wonder why I did this. She said, then I got a phone call. She was like, that's why. So I think of a school nurse and I think of somebody that's 60 and had a lot of experience walking around in the hall putting Band-Aids on. This woman was a retired pediatric cardiac nurse. And I still try to explain this stuff away at this point as how there's no God and this must be just a bunch of coincidences, right? Anyway, you want to see the power of Alcoholics Anonymous and its people? Find yourself or your family in a hospital. I remember calling my sponsor. I was looking out the window. I just was crying. I said, I don't know if I can handle this by myself, man. And people started coming. One after another after another. My sponsor fed half the nurses and doctors on the unit. It was amazing. You want to see a passionate prayer? Ask Susie Donahue to come pray over you. No joke. Amazing. And I'm sure that's available to anybody in the power of prayer that they can bring. She just happens to be special to me. The thing that I can really remember about this whole thing, as my son's recovering, he's having a lot of mental problems, doesn't know who he is. The sun goes down. There's a lot of hallucinations. He can't sleep. He doesn't know who we are. Anyway, about 2 a.m., I was sitting up next to him. He's in the bed, has no idea who he is, has no idea who I am. And I've been holding his hand sometimes. And, somewhere along the line when I made that amends and he got interested in AA. I know he wrote like a report in like 8th grade about Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was like, what the hell's going on here, right? This is weird. You should be thinking about your first drink, not what's in the book of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I remember holding his hand and just saying, do you want to pray? Thinking that I could maybe be of help to him, right? And he says, yeah. And he closes his eyes. And I'm about to pray, right? And I hear this from him. He says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. That kid in his hallucinations is praying. And I still want to explain this spiritual thing away. Must be some coincidence, right? Beautiful things can happen when God allows us to match chaos with serenity. I'm happy to say that somewhere between, 2017 and now, I have accepted in my heart that there is a spiritual solution, and it has made my life a lot easier. When I argue with my wife, which is rarely, but happened this weekend, I pray and I talk to my sponsor. I recognize that it's probably me that's causing the problem, and I need help. I can get some help from talking to Drew and staff, even Steve sometimes. But I need to go up. That's where the power is. And for a guy that came here thinking like, I don't want this spiritual solution, it's amazingly comforting. Peace and contentment and happiness. I think I'll end. I do this book study with a bunch of guys on Tuesdays, and we just finished reading Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers. And I love what Dr. Bob has to say. But this really struck me. It's different than what's in the big book because it's a little bit in his own words. But it's talking about the end of his life, and guys, whoever's asking me these questions says, Bob, why don't you stay home and conserve your strength? It says, Dr. Bob considered the question for a time. And then he said, the first reason is that this way is working so well. Why should I take a chance on any other way? The second reason is I don't want to deprive myself of the privilege of meeting, greeting, and visiting with fellow alcoholics. It is a pleasure to me. And the third reason is the most important. I belong at that meeting for the sake of the new man or woman who might walk through that door. I am living proof that AA will work as long as I work AA. And I owe it to the new person to be there. I am the living example. If I can do a tenth of what that man is talking about there, life is pretty good. My ego steps out of the way. And just be a channel for whatever words God puts in my thoughts. And hopefully I've transmitted something that's of interest to you all tonight. Thank you for having me.